Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jude Blanchette, and I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS. The proximate reason for today's discussion is because July 1st or July 23rd, depending on how much of a historical pedant you want to be, the Communist Party of China will be marking a 100th anniversary since its founding in 1921. And more than 70 of those years as the sole ruling party in the People's Republic of China. And this commemoration of a centenary is giving many pause to think about core questions about regime resiliency, durability, adaptability, and critically thinking about what's next for the Communist Party. And as we think about that really important question of where is it going under Xi Jinping, how are current elements of resiliency going to withstand the next decade and a half, and what potential new mechanisms of resiliency might the party create to support and buttress its rule? It's very important that we also look back and understand the Communist Party of China as a part of this much longer arc that looks at Chinese approaches to governance, state building, state capacity, stretching back a millennia. Too often, I think we create these very sharp, clear demarcations. Often, many of them are often in the near present, the Xi era, reform and opening, the Mao era, and don't often connect this to what legacies from China's long storied past may be impacting current approaches to governance. So questions like what connects today's CCP with emperors and state builders from the dynastic period, and what can this long ago past teach us about the CCP's future, I think are critical questions. And I'm delighted today to have really no better and no more capable guide as we navigate this really important question than Wang Yuhua, who is the Frederick S. Danziger Associate Professor of Government at Harvard University. And those of you who follow the Freeman Chair's work may feel like you're re-listening to last week's Pekingology podcast, where Yuhua gave us an hour of his time to explore many of these similar themes that are coming from a book which will be published by Princeton University Press next year. But I found that conversation so interesting and enlightening that I asked Yuhua if he could spare another 45 minutes to explore these topics earlier. So let me first just extend a really heartfelt welcome to Yuhua for joining us today.
Thanks, Jude. It's my pleasure to be here.
Before we get into the discussion, just a logistics note that folks can ask questions via submitting in a form that's available. If you go to the CSIS website, csis.org, and then click events, you should see the event page listed for our discussion today. And if you click that, there's a form you can fill. So please, I see some questions are actually already coming in. So would recommend and encourage people to ask questions throughout the event. And I will look at these and interject occasionally in the discussion and pose these. So appreciate folks participating. But let me, Yuhua, ask you a first question, and we're going to try to avoid just kind of running through names and dynasties, and instead ask a deeper set of questions about really important questions around state formation, state building, state capacity. I was, in preparation for this, reading a lot of your work, your working papers, and so for viewers, if any of these questions sound smart, it's because literally I have just mined Yuhua's work for his questions that he is exploring, and I'm going to pose these to him here. But you wrestle with some of the various theories of state formation that have been popularized in Western literature to explain the formation, especially in Europe, of states in the medieval period. and in other areas of the world. And you've got theorists like James Scott at Yale, Charles Tilly. And I wanted to ask you, of the dominant theories of state formation, which best captures the actual historical experience of the birth and growth of the state in ancient China? Are you finding that some of the dominant theorists have explanatory power, or are you needed to look elsewhere to explain China's experience?
Yeah, thanks, Jude. So for people who don't know Charles Tilly and James Scott, they are both intellectual giants in the social sciences. And Charles Tilly, used to teach at Michigan, Columbia, and he made a very famous argument that war made a state. Based on the experiences of European state building, the idea that when countries fought with each other, they got stronger. They became the modern nation state. But for applicability to the Chinese context, I found James Scott's idea more insightful. One of the great insights provided by James Scott is that the power of the state really depends on the ability of the state to make society legible, what we call legibility of the state. And then what that means is, the state needs to standardize things, for example, currency, measurement units, language, so that the state can very easily understand what the society is doing, what the people are doing. And then in his books, for example, he talked about, how streets are organized. For example, when you go to Philadelphia or New York, you see those grades. And then, that's one way the state can make things legible, because, if you see New York, for example, or Philadelphia from a satellite, you can see the grades, and then it's very easy to understand how to navigate the city. And then that's a design by the state. So that's a great insight by James Scott. And then one of the things that happened in Chinese history was exactly that. For example, in the Qin Dynasty, which was the first dynasty in China, and this is 2,000 years ago, the Qin government really took policies to standardize everything in China. For example, the currency, measurements, and also more importantly, language. We still benefit from that in today's China. People in different places speak very different dialects. If you go to the south, you go to north, they speak very different dialects, but we all use the same written language. And then we should all thank the first emperor of the Qin Dynasty. And then think about today's China as well. A lot of the really important policies in contemporary China, for example, the hukou policy. People who might know this. There's the idea that everyone, when they're born, they get a family registration, indicating where you are, your parents' names, and then your address, your ethnicity. And then that goes with you, as you grow up. And then it's very important in determining, for example, where you get your healthcare, where you can go to school. And then that's a great measure of standardization. That is, the state really standardize everything, and then they measure everyone's, profile, and then they keep that in record. The things we talk a lot about, about China, for example, social credits, the idea that everyone gets social credits, and then the idea that, we all get a score, is also part of this legibility effort by the state to standardize the society. So I find James Scott's idea of legibility really useful in understanding Chinese politics.
Well, can I ask you, why was the Qin Dynasty the first dynasty? In other words, what was it about that moment where there were both the necessary and sufficient factors that led that to being the first dynasty, or the first kind of real formation of the state? Why not 10 years earlier or 50 years earlier? Is it just a matter of sort of, primal states emerge when there is the requisite environmental, economic, social factors that don't exist day -1, or are there other reasons? Obviously in the history books, it's because you had Qin Shi Huangdi, right? It's the individual, the great man of history narrative is why the state formed then. And again, I think subsequent leaders prefer those stories because it places a prominence on a Mao Zedong or Xi Jinping as being the prime mover of history. But why do states form when they form?
That's a great question. I think the reason why the Qin state was so important is that the Qin government created a form of government that lasted in China for about 2,000 years. And then there were, minor changes in, the bureaucracy, in the military, in the fiscal system, in the next 2,000 years, in different dynasties, we see, slightly different forms of government, but the basic structure of the government, or the basic idea of a monarchical government, ruled by a monarchy at the top, and then assisted by an elite bureaucracy. That form of government was created during the Qin Dynasty by the first emperor, the Qin Shi Huangdi, in about 2,000 years ago. And then that's why the Qin government was very, very important. Before that was a very different form of government. Before the Qin Dynasty was called the the Western Zhou Dynasty, or the warring state period, and it was basically a feudal society where the emperors, or the kings of those kingdoms, actually didn't have a lot of power. They had to rely on the local feudal lords. In some sense, very similar to feudal Europe in the Middle Ages. But that was a very decentralized form of government, where basically the kings had to rely on feudal lords for war, for taxation. But then starting in the Qin Dynasty, you start to have this centralized monarchical state, which lasted in China for 2,000 years. So I think that's why it was so important. And then in terms of why that state was formed in this particular time, a lot of scholars have studied this, and then I think the consensus is very similar to Charles Tilly's idea about war making the state. The idea that during the warring state period, because of there were 7 kingdoms who were fighting with each other, for decades, and then the frequent wars among those kingdoms helped created the centralized Qin government, because the Qin state was the only one which was able to centralize resources and then use a relatively meritocratic system to choose bureaucrats, and then therefore they can win over other kingdoms when they were able to centralize and then unify China. So Tilly was right. I think Tilly was right in explaining the early state formation in China in terms of how war played a role in creating a centralized state.
Building on that, you've done some work with a colleague that starts with this idea. I think the work is by the work you build on is by Philip Hoffman, who looks at prevalence of war in early modern China and England and France, and finds that you had, again, some margin of difference, but essentially roughly the same prevalence of quote interstate war in those 3, France, England, and early modern China. And so, building on this idea of how war can shape state formation, we see though that those 3, the 3 entities go in very different directions. China goes in a very different direction than England and France. So I wanted to ask, the work that you've been doing that has looked at, so it's not just the concept of interstate war, it's the type of interstate war that matters. I wonder if you can talk about how China's particular flavor of interstate war had important knock-on effects for state formation moving forward.
Right. This is based on my joint work with Mark Dinchenko, who is teaching at the University of Michigan. And one thing we tried to do was, Tilly made this argument about war making the state, but it's really based on European experiences. And then what we try to do is just to see whether the theory from Europe can be generalizable to other places. And then, so based on my data collection on war in China, we just want to compare, for example, the number of wars, but also more importantly, like you said, the type of wars in Europe and China. And one striking finding we had is that in terms of the number of war, the number of conflicts, for example, from the year 1000 to the year 1900, China and Europe had roughly the same number. So, in terms of number, there were some differences, but very, very small differences. They had fought roughly the same number of wars in this 900 years. But then the huge difference existed in the types of war. And then in Europe, most of the wars were interstate. That is, most of the wars were between the states. That, for example, France fighting with England, and England fighting with Scotland, things like that. But in China, we show that more than 60% of the conflicts in China were internal. That is, most of the conflicts in China happened between the government and then some social forces. This might be peasants. We are familiar with peasant rebellions in China, but also a lot of artisans also had rebellions, but also local elites. Local elites launched a rebellion against the central government. So most of the conflicts in historical China actually happened within China between the imperial state, and then some social forces. And then we argue that that makes a huge difference. The type of conflicts makes a huge difference, which help us understand how Tilly's idea can travel outside of Europe. Because his argument is when war happens, when countries are preparing for war, that emergency kind of unified the whole country, right? The kings, the queens, and then the feudal lords, the merchants, the peasants, because they know that there's a foreign enemy, therefore they all coalesce together, they all get organized, they all want to contribute to the country's survival. And then, as Tilly argued, this is a very important mobilizing force to build a very strong state. War made the state. But then when the conflicts happen within the country between different groups of people, actually those internal conflicts are very divisive. This is the big difference between internal conflicts and external war. Internal conflicts tend to divide the country because this is about maybe the elites, and then with the emperor we are trying to repress the peasant rebellion, or it's because some local elites, they try to make one part of China independent from the whole. Therefore, the emperor need to rely on elites from other places to quell the challenges from this particular region. So therefore, those internal conflicts generate a very different type of states. It's not, in Europe, for example, when they unify things, and then when the emperor, when the kings need to rely on the local elites for resources, the kings need to make compromises. They have to, make compromises in parliaments, and then which created an early form of democracy. But in China, when the internal conflicts happened, it kind of divided the whole country. And then as a consequence, the type of state that China was able to develop over time was kind of a very repressive state. That is, some part of the country got together to repress the other part of the country, or some classes got together to repress other classes. So it's a very repressive state as a result of internal conflicts.
I wonder if we can put a pin in that and return to that later on when we're trying to think of extant legacies that may affect current approaches to governance. That's a really interesting point. Another one which when I was reading your work just surprised me is a connection between climate and state building. And I wonder if, in the podcast we had talked about a kind of an exogenous shock of climate shock, which played an important role. I think, what was it, the Song Dynasty, in terms of the composition of the elite. I wonder if you can spend a few minutes sort of just unpacking how shifting climate, whether sudden shocks or slow and longer shifts, have impacted state building and state, the direction of state building in China in the ancient period.
Yeah, climate change is critical. And then we now have a lot of scientific studies showing, first of all, climate change exists, and also climate change has a huge impact on conflict. We have a lot of papers and books showing that in contemporary periods, but it's also true actually in historical periods, because in the past 2,000 years, the surface temperature on Earth had varied a great deal in the last 2,000 years. And one thing that I found in my work was, in the last, say, 2,000 years in Chinese history, there were periods of exceptionally warm years. There were about 200 years from the early 11th century to the 13th century. There was about these 2 centuries, and then now scientists call them the medieval warm period. There was years in those 200, among those 200 years, that were abnormally warm. They were, say for example, about a half Celsius degree warmer than normal every year in those 200 years. And then also in the later period, for example, from the 14th century to the 19th century, about the 4th century or 5 centuries of really cold years. So among those centuries, we see some exceptionally cold years. And then scientists call them the Little Ice Age. And then those were really cold years. And then in my work, I found that they are highly correlated with the frequency of conflicts in China. Say, for example, the basic idea is that when the Earth was warm, or when the China proper, thinking about the Yellow River Valley, when China was warm, agricultural products will increase. That is, you tend to have harvest. Peasants will have a very good time in those warm years. But the problem of having warm years is it's a really good time for the nomadic tribes to attack China, because China just had more things to grab. That, you know, have a lot of resources, you have harvest every year, there's just more agricultural products to grab. So therefore, what I found in my work is during those warm years, for example, from the 11th century to 13th century, there were a lot of so-called external wars. That is, the nomadic tribe, for example, the Mongolians, you know, the Khitans, were more likely to attack China when China was warm. And then in the Little Ice Age, you know, from 14th century to 19th century, when the earth was cold, harvest were very difficult. So it's very difficult to get harvest. And then it's really bad for the domestic peasants. That is, the peasants who were, you know, relying on the harvest for a living. They really suffer from cold years. And then as a result of this, you are more likely to see famine, and then you're more likely to see domestic rebellions. That is, you know, large scale domestic rebellions were more likely to break out in those cold years. You know, for example, you know, the biggest one's a Taiping Rebellion in the mid-19th century, but also the Li Zicheng Rebellion, which overthrew the Ming Dynasty, you know, in the mid-17th century. So those huge, large-scale domestic peasant rebellions were more likely to happen during the cold years. And then, you know, this, you know, goes back to the point we just talked about earlier. That is, you know, you have those different types of conflicts, you know, external sometimes, you know, during the 11th century, 12th century, that's during Song Dynasty, but also, you know, domestic rebellions during the later years. So those types of conflicts would generate very different forces, not so dynamics in politics, but also in state building.
I wanted to return to something we discussed for a good deal of time in the podcast last week, and which is going to play a really critical role in your book, which is thinking about the role of political elite in pre-modern state building and state capacity. This is, you know, folks who look at contemporary Chinese politics think a lot about the role of elite in authoritarian politics, you know, as the selectorate, as the, you know, the base of the authoritarian leader, helping to keep him or her in power. And I had never really thought about the role elite play in pre-modern China. Again, going back to the sort of the great man of history narrative, you focus on the emperor, but obviously it's you know, the interesting stuff, the court drama is around the elite, the grand vizier, but you have a really structured way of thinking about how the structure of elite networks can have an important role on the calculations and behavior of the emperor. So I wonder if we could explore that a little bit. But before you do, maybe I could just get some definitional level setting. When you use the term elite, and when you think about the sort of elite in pre-modern China, can you just give us a little bit of granular feel? Who are we talking about in Song Dynasty China? What is a member of the political elite? Are these people formally employed at the court? Are these, you know, rich merchants? Who are these?
Yeah, to simplify things, you know, I tend to define so-called political or powerful political elites as the politicians who held very high positions in the central government. You know, think about these people as the central committee members in contemporary China, in the Chinese Communist Party. So those people are, you know, for example, prime ministers, you know, leaders of different ministries, also governors of different provinces. So these were, you know, no more than 200 people in each time period in the Song Dynasty, you know, to the Qin Dynasty. You know, thinking about the most powerful politicians in those dynasties, there were just about, you know, 150 sometimes central politicians who held, you know, ministerial positions in the central government.
Okay, now can you go into your core thesis on how the structure of elite networks impacted the calculations of the emperor?
Yeah, so a key question I was asking myself is, under what conditions would those powerful politicians, you know, those ministers, prime ministers, be interested in a strong state? We tend to take it for granted that they are, but actually they're not. You know, from the European history, you know, like I said, Charles Tilly would argue, you know, in the face of war, when there are external threats, everybody want to strengthen the state. So that's a very strong assumption in the European story. But then reading Chinese history makes me really doubt this assumption. That is, when I read stories of, you know, different dynasties, I saw different episodes in different dynasties where the top elites would actually debate about what they want to do with the state, in the face of war and also in the face of emergencies. And then that makes me think, should we really assume that everybody, in the central government want to have a strong state? And that led to, a series of questions that, which became the book. Now, one thing I found out is they're not. It's not true that everybody wants a strong state. It's true, some people might want a strong state because they get protection from a strong state. For example, when it comes to, for example, the Khitans or the Mongolians are coming, having a strong state can be protecting your family members, your land, for example, in different places. But also having a strong state also means paying taxes. And not everybody wants to pay taxes. Not every family want to pay a lot of taxes to the central government to make the central government stronger. And then in imperial China, what I found was oftentimes the powerful politicians often have a choice. That is, they can choose to strengthen the central state by paying taxes or mobilizing their family members to pay taxes, or they can keep their resources in their own families, which became a really viable option actually since the Song Dynasty. That is, and people probably know this, in China, there's this very prominent form of family organization called lineage organizations. The idea of we belong to the same ancestor, this is from 5 generations above. And then now, we have probably thousands of people, we all belong to the same ancestor. Therefore, we can form this lineage organization, a clan, so to speak. And then we can donate, each of the branches in the clan can donate some land to the common good of the clan. Therefore, and we can use the income from that pot of land to fund, funerals, education, weddings, things like that. And then also in later times, we also see more common that each clan would have its own militia. That is, they have their own military organization. They would, hire their clansmen and then as soldiers and then fight those bandits, rebels. And then so therefore there was this choice to be made by the Chinese elites. Do you want to pay taxes to the central state to make the state stronger? So therefore, when you're in trouble, you go to the state, or you can, evade the taxes. You can keep the resources in your own clan organization, your lineage organization, and then make your clan stronger. That you have more land controlled by your own clan. You have a stronger militia controlled by your family. Therefore, when things happen, you can rely on your own family. So that was a very obvious choice in imperial China. And then what I found in my book is over time, since the Song Dynasty, and then in Ming and Qing in particular, Chinese elites were more likely to choose their own families when they had trouble. They tend not to pay taxes to the central state, and then they tend to prefer to strengthen their families. The primary reason for this choice was that this is going back to what Drew talks about kinship networks or kinship relations, is that over time in China, the Chinese elites, those powerful people, their social relations tend to become more and more localized. That is, before, for example, before the Song Dynasty, in the Tang period, the Sui period, people tend to have kinship relations scattered all over the country. You might have your aunt, living in the north. You have your daughter married to a guy, from the south. So therefore, your kinship relations are scattered all over the country, and it makes more sense in that case to have a strong state, because you have to, protect your family members everywhere. You have, some people there, some people there. It's much better to have a strong national government. But then starting in the Song Dynasty, the elite's social relations became much more localized. The idea that, say, for example, all my children's marriages are basically within my own county. My son married a girl from, the neighboring village, and then my daughter married to a guy, in another village in the same county. So that's a broader trend in Chinese history, the localization of Chinese elites. Now, in that sense, when you have a localized kinship network, when everybody, for example, you care about is within, say, for example, within the same county or within the same city, you don't care for a strong state, because it doesn't really make sense, right? To pay taxes to the capital, to the center in the capital, which is far away from you. And then they will spend the money on the north, on the south, and then you don't really care about those places, right? You only care about your own home county. And then in that sense, starting in the Song Dynasty, I argue Chinese elites were more likely to keep their resources at the local level in their families, and then to strengthen their family organizations to rely on those family organizations to protect themselves, to provide local public goods. I think that's a broader trend in Chinese history that is very important in understanding Chinese state building.
And the practical effect of that is the emperor's position is more secure because the elites are more inward focused or downward focused. But there's a trade-off in state capacity because now you're not having as many resources flow up into the center. And so the state is capable of doing less. So that's actually a really good, that's a really good pivot to the transitioning to the more modern period. If we have that Song dynasty onward trajectory of a safer emperor, but a increasingly ineffective state capacity, can we tie that to the year 1911? In other words, do we see a connection between the final ultimate breakdown of the dynastic system with the collapse of the Qin Dynasty and this longer story of state capacity, or are there other sort of critical factors that led to this disjuncture? In other words, why didn't the collapse of the Qing Dynasty lead to yet another dynasty taking hold in that sort of same pattern of dynastic ups and downs? We seem to have seen a pretty clear break in governance in 1911. That, of course, that culminates in some ways, just within a decade or so. But why was that? Is that connected to state capacity?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jude. So what held imperial China together, I argue in my book, was the ties between the central elites and then the local social forces. And then, thinking about, again, those ministers, the chief chancellors in the central government, they all had ties with local lineage organizations. They're either from them or they have marriage ties with them, they have social ties with them. And then those social ties really was what held the imperial state together. That is, you have those local forces that are, thousands of them, maybe prominent ones, scattered in different places in the empire. But then you have the central government, the central bureaucracy, and then the central guys all have ties that connect each of those local social groups. And then I think, I argue that those ties were the things that held the whole country together. But what happened in the late Qing period was those ties were cut by different things. First of all, one really important event in late Qing period was the Taiping Rebellion. And what happened, this is the largest scale of mass rebellion in Chinese history, probably in world history. Millions of people died during the Taiping Rebellion. And then what happened during and after the Taiping Rebellion was the Qing emperors were trying to protect themselves. Therefore, what they did, and then the Qing government was really weak. This is after the Opium War. So the Qing government was really, really weak. And then what happened was the Qing emperors allowed the local lineage organizations, local forces to have their own military organizations. And then, so this is, one way to fend off the rebellion. That is, I cannot take care of you, you take care of yourself. But also, you also protect me, because when you form your own private militia, you can fight with the rebels, and therefore you can protect me. So that's one way the emperors, used to protect themselves. And then, but what happened was those local social forces became really strong and also independent from the state. Before, they still have the ties with the central bureaucracy, but afterwards they start to have their own means of force. This is what Max Weber talked about. This is the monopoly over violence was over in China. That is, local forces started to control means of violence. They start to have local militia. This is very important. And then the second really important thing that cut the ties was the abolishment of the civil service examination system. So the whole examination system was a really important way to connect the central bureaucracy and the local social forces. That is, those local families, local landowning families, there is only one way for them to connect with the central bureaucracy. That is, every 3 years, they can send their sons to attend the civil service examination in the hope that, some of them can succeed and become one member in the central bureaucracy. And a lot of families did. So they send their sons to the central bureaucracy. Then those sons serve as the ties between the emperor and then the local forces. But then in 1905, because of criticisms of the whole examination system. So a lot of intellectuals blame the examination system for the problems that were prevalent in China. For example, a weak military, bad technologies. They all blame the education system. So the emperor abolished the civil service examination system, which finally cut all the ties that the emperor had with the social forces. Therefore, so I argue that that was really the last straw. And then that cut all the ties between the central bureaucracy, the emperor, and then the local social forces. And then what happened afterwards in the next 6 years was, those local social forces became autonomous, independent, also very strong. They control local military, they control local fiscal affairs, and then they all declared independence in 1911. So that was, the connections between the society and the state were basically disconnected in the first 10 years of the 20th century.
And now let's bring this up to the formation, the creation of the CCP in 1921, but critically, once the party comes to power in 1949, I'm curious now, your vantage point, you've written a book, that's looking at the contemporary governance, and now you're working on a book that's looking back 2 millennia. And I'm curious, how do you situate the Communist parties? Again, there's not been just one approach that the Communist Party has had to governance. It's evolved over time. But where do you situate the party in this longer arc of governance experience on state capacity? And critically, I think some of the elements you've talked about so far, for example, the internecine warfare, which has been about putting down rebellions, and the shifting composition of elite networks. How do those stories tie into the present for you?
Yeah, it's a great question to think about. I think what Imperial China left for the CCP was a great challenge for state building. That is, in the 1920s, you were talking about the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. So they were founded in 1921. When the party was founded, the Chinese political system was very different from Imperial China. So there was not an emperor, for example, in the Forbidden City. There was not a civil service examination system, right, which the party could rely on to recruit bureaucrats. So the political system was very different from Imperial China. However, the society was very similar to the society in Imperial China. That is, if you go to a village, the village you see in 1920s was basically the same, in terms of social structure. It's basically similar to the social structure, for example, 100 years earlier, that is in the early 19th century, in terms of, it was ruled by a few prominent land-owning gentry families. That is, for example, if you go to a small village in North China, it's probably the Wang, the Wang clan that ruled this village. If you go to the south, maybe there are more families in the same village, maybe the Li family or the Zhang family. There were different families, then they all landowners, and then they were the dominant elites in that small village. This is true in China for 1,000 years. And that was actually the huge challenge for the CCP to build a modern state, because one of the things that the CCP was needed to do is to mobilize the peasants for a communist revolution. Right? This is the definition of a communist revolution. That is, you need to mobilize the peasants against the landlords in order to promote a communist revolution. But what happened when they went to the villages? And Mao wrote about this. Mao Zedong in his writings wrote about this. When he was in Jinggangshan, when he became one of the leaders of the party, he was trying to mobilize the peasants in Jinggangshan, in the small villages. And one of the things he realized was it's impossible to do this, because in the villages, the peasants all belong to their own clan organizations, their lineage groups. For example, if you talk to this peasant, with the surname Li, you are trying to mobilize the peasant Li to, participate in land reform against the landlords. What Mao found out was the landlords was often also with the surname Li. That is, they were from the same family. The peasant, the landlords were from the same family. So it's very difficult to mobilize family members against each other. And then Mao wrote about this, so the clan, the lineage organizations basically are cross-cutting the class cleavages in China. That is, you cannot really make people realize they belong to a class, because people all have this feeling that they belong to this family. You know, I belong to Wang family, you belong to the Li family. And then it's about the families, it's our conflicts that is the most important. It's not about, for example, within the family, my uncle is the landlord and I'm a peasant. It's not about this tension. This is not important in China at the time. So that was a huge challenge for Mao. And then in the South, therefore, the land reforms were really unsuccessful. And we all know this part of the CCP's history, that they later marched to the north. They went to Yan'an, and then it's actually in the north the CCP started to be successful. And then this is because in the north, the lineage organizations were much, much weaker than in the south. So, and this is historically true that, you know, in general, in the north, because of conflict, you know, wars and also natural disasters, lineage organizations were much, much weaker in the north than in the south. Therefore, it's much easier for Mao and also the party to mobilize the peasants against the landlords because they usually do not belong to the same clan organization. So therefore, you know, I argue in my book that's really the legacy from Imperial China for the CCP. That is, you know, the social structure left by Imperial China created this very unique challenge for state building in the contemporary era. And then the reason why CCP was so successful is because they, you know, they went to the north and then they started with something that is easier to do. That is, in the north, they can do this. And then once they control power, they can make this a national policy. They only started to have land reforms in the south starting in the 1950s after they controlled the central government. And then, you know, that can also explain, you know, the durability of the Chinese Communist Party that we see today. The one thing that the Chinese Communist Party did very differently from imperial governments was the Communist Party can control very grassroots organizations. And this is something the imperial Chinese government was never able to do. They were never able to control local organizations because at the local level, it's always the families, always the land-owning elites who control the local forces. And then in the contemporary era, starting in the 1950s, we all know, you know, for example, neighborhood communities, you know, those local grassroots organizations started to become part of the state. So the party can appoint party members, for example, in the very local level, and also in the military, also in all types of social organizations, in the schools, all kinds of social enterprises, you know, companies now, private companies now, even foreign companies now have party cells. And this is something that Imperial China was never able to do, to have this penetration at the lowest level of the society. I think that's really key to understanding the durability of the regime now.
I was just realizing, Yuhua, we're almost out of time, which means I'm going to make you come back every week for the next year till we plumb the entire depths. But maybe I'll just leave you with I've got 50 more questions for you, but I'll just leave you with one. And this just builds on what you were just talking about, this issue of resiliency. And I wondered if you could offer a forward-looking, what's an element of regime durability or resiliency you think is underappreciated by external observers? And then my follow-up is, what is the biggest risk to resiliency that you see either today or on the horizon for the CCP?
Yeah, just for maybe in 2 minutes, I can get this. Well, I think one thing that we often underappreciate is the ability, again, the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to mobilize society. And then we see that really during the pandemic, that is, you know, for example, people, you know, check on each other, check on their neighbors, the neighborhood communities, really check on all the residents in the community. And then you get, you know, people knock on your door to check your temperature, things like that. That's really important, you know, in terms of successfully implementing policies, but also monitoring the population, you know, mobilizing people for vaccination now, you know. So the ability of the party to mobilize, to penetrate society and then mobilize society at the grassroots level, I think it's really important in explaining the durability of the regime. And then just, you know, looking forward, I think in the next few years, what worries me most, and then you and Richard McGregor wrote about this, is actually succession. That is, you know, that you know, keeps me up at night sometimes. That is, when I think about the next 10 years, for example, the thing that worries me the most is who will become the next leader after Xi Jinping. And we have no idea, right? Nobody has any idea about this. I think it's very dangerous because, you know, back to imperial China, imperial Chinese emperors had a rule that is it's always the son, right? It's very simple. That is one of my sons. It's not always the eldest son. It's probably the smartest son, but they always had a son. And then, primogeniture or not, but they always have a crown prince. They appoint and then anoint, for example, before the older emperor died. They always have someone, and then they at least know about this. This is the guy, this is the younger person that I have to, build my coalition around. But now in China, we don't have this person. We don't have a crown prince. We don't have an heir apparent. And this is very dangerous because the elites have no idea how to plan their future. And also it's dangerous because everyone thinks they have a chance. Everyone now in the Central Committee think that they have a chance. I think this is a very dangerous moment for Chinese politics.
Yuhua, again, I could go on another hour with you. I really appreciate your time and your insights here. Just as a reminder for folks, expect a book hopefully coming next year, which explores all these topics in more depth. I would say for anyone who's interested by what they heard today, if you go to Yuhua's website on the Harvard University website, there's a good list on his page of not his journal articles, but I think if you go to other writing, Yuhua is writing for a blog called Broad Street, which is really, really fantastic, which is on historical political economy. It's got a lot of academic contributors, but Yuhua has been doing a lot of great writing on a lot of the themes that we were talking about today. And I just learned a lot reading those. So folks who don't want to wait a year can get a glimpse into some of these really, really fantastic insights and themes by going to the Broad Street blog. But again, all of that is available. Just search Wang Yuhua Harvard and you'll get his page. Yuhua, thank you again for your time. Thanks for doing the podcast. I've called on you quite a bit over the past few weeks and just really appreciate your objective historical view of these really, really important questions.
Thanks, Jude, for having me. This is so fun.
Great. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a good afternoon.